Mr. Giakoumis is with us, so we're just waiting for our official start.
Hello, hello.
All right, we can hear you nice and clear. I hope you can hear us nice and clear.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. All right. Okay.
All right, everybody, welcome. This is Porphyria Foundation's Hellenic History Series, and this is the Quest for Prometheus, first online Zoom special. And we are very pleased to have with us a good friend, historian and author Peter Giakoumis. And he's going to be talking about his new book, The Forgotten Heroes of the Balkan Wars,
Which is
Greek-Americans and PhilHellenes,
right here.
1912-1913.
A lot of reading to do, folks, and some interesting stuff. Peter's a very interesting person. He's authored. This is not the first book he's authored, but I'd say it's definitely the most. This is the first book that I've become familiar with Peter. I haven't yet contacted your other material, but I'll say this much: when I met Peter the first time I met him, he was in a Byzantine costume, and I think that's a very good reflection of Peter because he's a historical consultant on the Greek military history. He actually has direct military experience himself. He's a reserve captain, Army Division of the New York Guards. And also he has a master's in international relations. On top of that, he's also a filmmaker. He's the vice president of Byzantine Crown Productions. He directed a short film, musical short film called Phoenix Reigns 1453 on the Eve of the Fall, which you can also see on YouTube. And Billy was involved in that as well. So very interesting person. And I have to say, finishing a book of this size, this magnitude, is an achievement in and of itself. But it's even better when it's done on a subject that is underexplored, and that's one of the most important things in the history. Whenever you do historical analysis, is not just to reinvent the wheel, but to go and bring something new to the table. And I think Peter's done that very well with this book. And I've just started familiarizing myself with it. As you can see, there's a lot to go through here. But I think an important thing is always in history, it's the new stuff you bring out. It's the discoveries that you make. And Peter's volume speaks a lot about that. We briefly talked to Peter about that. We had a special show we did with Peter on this book, but it was only a brief show because this was the real highlight event we wanted to do. We wanted to actually really get focused on this book, and we also wanted other people to participate and talk in detail about it. So, Peter, why don't you give us a brief, first of all, why did you pick the Balkan Wars? What was it about the Balkan Wars that really got you excited?
Well, it's interesting that you bring it up this way. First of all, Greece, in and of itself, prior to World War I, was a very, very small kingdom. And in the modern sense, Greece has been through a lot, just like the world itself. But 2 wars in a small amount of time that Greece actually won in the 20th century is remarkable in and of itself. And one of the questions that comes up often is, why is it important? Why is this subject important? And that all kinds of ties into why I decided to, look into this more. And if I say to anybody, have you ever heard of the second largest city in Greece, Salonika? Have you ever heard of Mount Athos? How about some of the islands like Limnos, Lesvos, Samos, Chios? A lot of people know that, especially, those with Greek backgrounds. Epirus, Macedonia. If it wasn't for the Balkan Wars, those would not be part of Greece. So modern map of Greece was defined by the 2 Balkan Wars. Now, in terms of victories, 2 definitive victories, Greece had lost, in 1897, had lost a small, very brief war with the Ottoman Empire and nearly lost everything if it wasn't for the Western powers. So they had been under that cloud of defeat, and they wanted to unify their people. And the sick man of Europe was prevalent. Italy had already gone to war with the Ottomans and won. And now Greece and others were looking to bring back what they were, who they were, their people. And so I started looking into this, and I thought it was interesting in and of itself, these 2 victories for the Greek people and the expansion of Greece. And then from there, I happened to find out that Greek-Americans took part in these 2 wars. And I just became fascinated. From there, it just snowballed, went right into it, and there was no turning back.
It's a very interesting subject because it's right by a very big meaty event, which is World War I, right? And
Absolutely.
so that's what it just swings a lot of attention from there. But just kind of like, and we were discussing this earlier in our previous webcast, just as the Spanish Civil War was kind of the rehearsal for World War II. In some ways, I believe you drew some very interesting parallels with this and World War I, which is just around the corner from this. And there were again tensions, precursors, all of that, including fighting strategies. So maybe we could dive into that for a second.
Right. Well, obviously, around this time, there were two major players in the world, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. So the Triple Alliance was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And the Triple Entente was France, Great Britain, and Russia. So those are the two, the two groups that were playing in one off of the other. Now, in the middle of all this was the Balkans, right? And the Ottoman Empire. So whether it was going to happen before 1914 or after 1914 or in 1914, there was a war brewing. Austria-Hungary was just itching to start something, to expand themselves. And with that, that's in the background. Now, the alliances were drawn out, and Italy made a push to take some land and take some areas from the Ottomans, and they were successful. And at this point, the Balkans were they were just about ready to embrace their people, those unredeemed areas. So Greece as a kingdom, Montenegro, Serbia, and Bulgaria felt that there were people, Christians of ethnic backgrounds, that had to be taken back from the Ottomans. And with the help of the French and the British, the Greeks reorganized their military, navy, and army, and so did the Ottomans. They tried to reorganize and modernize their military as well, and so did the Serbians and Montenegrins and the Bulgarians. And the Italians actually pushed Montenegro to declare war on the Ottomans. So because of the pacts that existed, that was the beginning of the First Balkan War.
Very interesting. So, it's amazing because, there are a lot in the Balkans, there are a lot of these, what they're called lesser powers sometimes, but they're so critical to the rest of Europe. And that's where, again, World War I, where does it begin? It begins in the Balkans, right?
And it begins, it begins out of the Balkan Wars. That's where this all comes about. The alliances, they were watching very carefully. So they saw these these little countries fighting it out. They believed that they could do the same, quicker, more efficient, since they all had a bigger industry. So they could churn out better soldiers, better uniforms, better equipment, better everything than these small countries that they were selling, second-rate weapons to. So that was how the powers perceived what was unfolding in the Balkans.
Interesting. One thing I also want to mention with this book is this isn't just, a bird's eye geopolitical analysis of the situation. What I find particularly fascinating about your book is that you basically decide to focus on, as we'll call them, the little people, but actually the people who fought the war, the actual people who went out there, and all the way down to the last private, people who actually were in the trenches, so to speak. And you actually mentioned also, I remember the trench warfare basically got its start from here. But it's amazing that you've actually gone through and individually analyzed the fates of people. And it's very possible that these people, that those who descended from them are actually going to find some interesting things here in this book. So this isn't, again, just a bird's eye analysis, but you also do analysis here for sure of the historical events, but you get really down into the nitty gritty. And I think that's very interesting for numerous reasons, not the least of which, it allows people to get a very good feel for what the regular person, what the foot soldier was feeling at the time. More so, you focus on the Greek-American community and the issues with the diaspora. So maybe you could delve into that and tell us who is that person that you envisioned in your head when you were writing this, that participant in the war. what drove you to actually go and delve into these individual fates?
Well,
Yeah,
perfect
you answered
setup.
my question, George.
I'm right here, so I'm reading your brainwaves.
It's the perfect question. The whole reason for writing the book was to follow the Greek-American regiment that fought in Greece, right? These Greek-Americans or Americanized Greeks, they were migrant Greeks that came to the United States to find work and help fund their families back home and eventually go back home. So when I found that there were former soldiers, reservists in the Greek army, they had done their active duty and now they were in a reserve status for a few years, they ended up finding work all over the United States, and particularly a group in New York. So the group in New York and in other cities continued to get together in loose military clubs, and they would do some drilling. They even got surplus American uniforms. Those were the guys that I discovered perchance and was fascinated by how they maintained themselves as an ethnic group. They knew that they were obligated to go back to the homeland. They were migrants, so they weren't looking to stay here in the United States. But as time went on, since they got here in the early 1900s, so between 1905 and 1910, there were hundreds of thousands of the Greeks that came here, and they started to refer to them as Americanized Greeks. They started to embrace American culture. So this regiment, so to speak, this group of Americanized Greeks that were drilling, they were continuing this martial spirit, so to speak, that they had, knowing that they had to go back home, did go home. They did leave when the war broke out, and they fought on the front lines in U.S. Army surplus uniforms. That's what caught my attention. Now, in writing the book, I realized that a lot of people, they don't know much about the Balkan Wars. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It was a very short war, and World War I came, World War II, the Civil War in Greece, Korean War, all types of situations. Skipped over Asia Minor, of course, and not to mention what was going on in the United States for those that stayed. So the Balkan Wars became almost like a footnote. So even in modern research, there's not a lot written about those men that sacrificed everything, that went back to Greece, and many of them, the majority of them, actually came back to the United States. They formed the basis for the oldest Greek-American communities that exist in the United States. They formed. So that's what fascinated me. That was what I was following. But how do you tell that story without giving it context? If I just told you, this bunch of guys decided to go back to Greece and come to the United States later, it doesn't give you the context that's necessary. A lot of the older Greek Americans, they've lost the connection, and a lot of them, they don't differentiate between, I don't know, my great grandfather or grandfather, he fought in World War I or something else, or Asia Minor, or even the Balkan Wars. They're not sure. Very few, they confuse it all. So that's why my book ended up being a little bit bigger than I anticipated, but it gives you context. I wanted it to be a reference so that anybody that gets it is getting the full picture.
Well, it's amazing that you do. One of the things we discussed also is that I think you went all the way out of the way to even get an old microfilm reader. You actually bought a microfilm reader so you can plow through the myriad of newspaper microfilms of the era, which you faithfully transcribe over here, which discuss some individual people's fates in their service, which I think is a very unusual thing to see in these kind of compendiums.
What I want to say, Peter, is this is a part of Hellenic history that's it's a shame that it's overlooked, that there are no celebrations, there are no commemorations. This is an international event where Greece had these two great victories and basically defeated the Ottoman Empire along with Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro. So it's a shame, and it's something that we want to push and promote, that this should be taught in academia, because this is more important than anything else aside from Greek independence. You know, we had Ohi Day, where Greece under Metaxas defeated Mussolini. You know, celebrate October 28th, but that's just a short victory. It wasn't a military victory in the end because we did lose to the Nazis. So this is the actual only victory that doubled Greece and made us have a homeland. Right? When we talk about Macedonia, the Macedonian struggle, getting back Crete, getting back Epirus, Thrace, all these other places, Thessaly, you know, these are the wars that made that happen, and we have a homeland because of the Balkan Wars and all the other Balkan people, and we got rid of the Turks. These people that are, you know, this empire that keeps on committing genocide, atrocities, occupying and meddling in the Mediterranean and the Aegean, and this is a very, very huge victory for the world, that we were able to stop the Turks, and through these alliances that all these other you know, the powers that be of the time had, you know, it began World War One. So when you're a historian and a history buff, and you're, you know, only taught about World War One and World War Two, that's kind of a crime too. You're getting shorted on actually history and the reasons why those wars began. It's because of one of the reasons is the Balkan Wars.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that I felt was important for us to actually give, you know, some context to all of this. And if we all work together, you know, we can save this history. And that's, you know, that kind of talks into the title of the actual book itself, right? It's The Forgotten Heroes. You know, what did these guys accomplish in the short amount of time and the two wars that they were involved in? You know, what was it that they did? And I mentioned early on, right? Greece doubled geographically in size, both geography and in terms of population. And all of these areas that Greece unified, it's the only country that kept its border and expanded after the Balkan Wars. Nobody else kept the same boundaries. Everybody else changed after World War I and World War II, but not Greece. So, you know, it's a shame. And not to mention the fact that these Greek-Americans helped establish the oldest Greek communities, you know, Greek-American ethnic communities throughout the United States, is these men. These are the guys that did it. And it's a shame. And I got one last thing, being that it's kind of linked, is that one of the biggest, if not the biggest ethnic group that served in World War I were Greek Americans, and the bulk of those were Balkan War veterans.
Mm-hmm. That's what I wanted to point out when I was reading your book. Actually, that's very true, and that should make us proud that we were not people that were just going to fight for Greece. You know, we were fighting for our motherland here as well in America, and America was getting trained soldiers to fight its war. This was a bonus for America, and you're gonna learn that when you read Peter's book. But I also I found something else that's very interesting. A lot of the jobs these early Greek immigrants had at the turn of the century, of the 1900s, which I keep on finding more articles, and I do post, we post in Love Letters to Greece here on Facebook, is that a lot of the jobs that they had were in the confectionery business, right, Peter? You did a lot of research. You were translating those newspapers. Ice cream, chocolate, sweets.
I do a lot of that research every day, Billy.
We do that too. We post pictures of Galakaburica and ice cream too.
It's a great field to research very thoroughly. Trust me.
They created the first confectionery union. The chocolatier union was created by Greek Americans. They were very successful in the chocolate industry. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of candies that still exist from that time. And I don't know if you're familiar with Andes. They're actually little, green mint chocolates wrapped. They're kind of small, sort of little rectangles. That still exists from the 1910s. That's a Greek-American invention. And that's just one that still exists as it is from then. And yeah, candy was a big deal. So was ice cream, fruit, flowers. The flower market was dominated by the Greeks back in the
Well,
day.
the candy thing, this all ties up to a lot of things with the homeland. A lot of the confectioneers and the chocolatiers come from Constantinople, right? They're the first ones that were the main chocolatiers to about 10 years ago in Constantinople. And these are some of the families that came to America as well, and they began a business here. And the reason I'm saying this is because they have ties, with liberating their homeland back, because that's where they come from, the unoccupied lands now. Thrace is where Constantinople is. It's not even Asia Minor at this point. So these are people that were gonna go back eventually to help their parents, their grandparents, their villages. So they started with these jobs that we see now as they're not like the lawyers and doctors of the later generations, but they started from the ground up. But they made America. They made the big influence and a stamp in America too, culinary.
What's surprising is that these Greek Americans or Americanized Greeks, they had very well educated Greeks here as well. Some of them were in college that left for the Balkan Wars. There were attorneys that actually went to law school here. I uncovered a lot of people that have been forgotten over time. They may have been well known in certain places, like in Chicago, but I don't know that anyone's really featured them outside of my work. And you were talking about some of the influences. I want to read a little quick passage from my book on page 313. Americanized Greeks didn't go back to being parochial Greeks once they returned to their homeland. Instead, they made it a point to speak in their Americanized English and promote the contemporary music they had left behind, almost as a badge of pride, proclaiming they had come from working abroad. This is from the Seattle Star, Seattle, Washington. American Greeks headline, American Greeks whistle ragtime on firing line. American correspondent with the Greek Army of Invasion, Athens, November 16th. Some of them are dead now at Elassona, where the Greeks, with heavy loss themselves, put the Turkish army to flight. But they made a fine-looking crowd. The Greek boys who came from America to fight in the mountains of Turkey and Europe. Who won the World Series? Yelled one bright-looking young fellow when he met an American newspaper man. He used to be a bootblack in the Broadway parlor. Gee, he said. So, Christy Matheson went on, the bum he is. Too bad. Well, every dog has his day. There's one thing about Christy. The Giants never had a pitcher who hit a booze less than him. And it goes on. So it goes to show how some of these, younger Greeks, they took on a passion for, where they came from. We're talking about them being Americans and Americanized. And this is something that they really, this grew on them. They accepted that they were adopting another homeland. So yes, the idea or the concept that they were ethnic and that they were going to serve, they were patriots, but they also were adopting this other homeland that they brought with them to Greece and then back. So I kind of thought that was interesting that these guys are, proud to speak in their broken English and whistling ragtime and wanting to listen to American music, even when they're over in Greece and they're fighting. And, they brought American flags with them. Actually, one of the museums in Greece still has one, the one that one of the regiments brought with them. And they were very proud. The Greek Americans or the Americanized Greeks were very, very proud of what they did and what they were accomplishing and the fact that they had worked hard. And a lot of them went into the restaurant business right from the beginning. Had to put that out as well.
I want to start first, Peter, with one quick question. So we're talking about the restaurant business. We're talking about it's very hard to even imagine as coming as an immigrant from a war-torn country or a country that had a lot of political ups and downs, and the economy was bad. And they're coming to America. They're starting a new life, and you're finding a lot of this information of these people that are getting into the restaurant business, the ice cream business, lawyers, movie people as well. They were starting the film industry. The Scudder's brothers, don't forget that, the three brothers that began Hollywood in the East. They had to come from somewhere, and now they're starting all over again. And all of a sudden, they have a call of duty. But it's not just to go to Greece and then forget about America. As we're finding out from reading your book, a lot of them, they said, as Americans, we're going to come back and then we're going to fight for World War One. If there's a world war, we're going to come back and we're going to fight. We're not just, having these fighting military clubs, right? You discussed there was a lot of military clubs that were being formed in cities where Greek-Americans were stationed a lot, and they were going to come back and continue fighting, which is kind of like amazing to hear that about our ancestors. And a lot of people don't even know that not only that they did that, but they fought to liberate their land, their country, and then to fight against the Axis powers afterwards for America as well.
Well, it's interesting to note that back in those days, people almost intuitively felt there was going to be a conflict. It was actually kind of out there already. People understood. It was just really a question of timing. So I think, yeah, that's an interesting thing to point out. Yeah.
If you were to actually follow the newspapers of the time, it's plain as day, right? So obviously, since they didn't have they didn't have TV and they didn't have the radio yet, it was important to get as much information as you could through the newspapers, and even the local papers, for the most part, from even the smaller cities. They were watching what was going on around the world, but the United States was also getting involved in issues in, south of the border, Nicaragua, Cuba. So there was always a global dynamic. So people could see, they knew, and especially you mentioned how they had an intuition. It was almost a given around 1910 that there was going to be a war.
Yes.
And that got put off a little bit. And you mentioned how these Greeks had come from a poor country. Greece from the beginning started out in debt. And the amount of money that they borrowed from, France and England to actually wage the Balkan Wars is incredible. Luckily, they won. And when they got into World War I, some of their debt was absolved, but without money you can't fight wars. But the Greeks, these Greeks came from a bad situation. There'd been at least 4 bankruptcies in Greece. So where do you go where there's no work, there's no industry? So you come to where they say there's gold in the streets. You come to the United States, and if you work hard, you're going to make money. And they did. They made a lot of money. They left businesses, they left homes. And as a matter of fact, Billy, I think you probably already know that some of these Greeks that left the United States in 1912, a good portion of them, maybe 20%, were actually American citizens.
Yes. Yeah, we talk a lot about people coming to America, but they had to become citizens. And a lot of them did their paperwork. They eventually had to, register.
They wanted to guarantee that they could come back.
Yes.
Right? So no matter what, they were going to go to Greece, they were going to do their duty, but they wanted to come back. And the one way that they felt that they could guarantee was they had to leave as American citizens. So this way nobody could say, no, you can't leave in case something else happens.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting question, Peter. That leads me into my next question, which we also touched on in our initial webcast. When we take a look at American nationals fighting in what is essentially officially still, even before all these alliances and everything were built, there's still a foreign war as far as the United States is concerned. How did the American government take to that? And were there any pressures on anybody's side to view the participants of those wars in any way as maybe fighting for a foreign power and so on and so forth? Were there any conflicts in that area? How did that go?
Well, it's interesting to actually read into what was going on in terms of using the American sources that I was working with, because that was very important. Right, you want to know what is the government doing? Well, the American government pretty much decided that these migrants weren't Americans to begin with. And since they were just here to work and to effectively go back at some point, that they can't bar them, right? You can't tell them, no, you can't go back to your homeland. They're leaving. They're willingly leaving and going back to where they came from.
Repatriating, basically.
Yes, they're repatriating. Now, they raised money here. They raised money amongst the Greek community. There's evidence. I found articles where Italians also helped the Greeks raise money, and they actually, I have some of the figures as well. So there was, amongst the other ethnic groups, there was support, but there weren't a lot of them. So the Italians, absolutely, and the others, they were busy doing their own thing. However, or they were assimilating. So when you're talking about, say the Irish or the Germans or others, they were already assimilating, and they thought, generally speaking, they thought that what was going on was very peculiar. So this had really not gone on this scale ever before. So for these migrant workers to all of a sudden drop everything, and when they dropped everything, there was an impact on the economy of the United States. So the Greeks had actually embedded themselves in wherever they found good paying jobs, they were there. So when you talked about ice cream, candy, flowers, the mills, working in steel mills, all of that stuff, when they left, they were having issues. They were really concerned about transporting goods to market, because some of the Greeks had become truck drivers in 1912, and they were dominating
supply chain.
So it was pretty interesting that the industry, American industry, was worried about it. The Turkish government lodged formal complaints with Washington, D.C., but Washington itself was, this is going to kind of play out on its own. The people, though, the American public, they were very much behind the Greeks. They kind of liked them. They saw them as hardworking individuals, stayed out of trouble. They weren't drunks. They weren't rabble rousers. They weren't troublemakers. So they respected that. And I have one particular passage from the book that talks about how praises Greeks who joined the army. Says Americans have more respect than ever for men from the Mediterranean. From the patriotic Greeks during the Balkan Wars, Americans could draw a new inspiration, says a writer in the National magazine. I found them in groups at the stations in Boston, New York, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago, returning home to serve in the army of their country. Their eyes flashed with something of that spirit that animated the Grecian heroes of history. I felt myself at times as if talking with the heroes of Marathon and those Greek warriors who were later deified on Mount Olympus. As they sat on their grips and suitcases waiting for the trains, they commented in broken English upon the differences in the appearance of their baggage now and when they arrived in America. Many a reservist expressed his appreciation that he'd been welcomed to America, but the call to arms from the fatherland was stronger than all other hopes and aims. And that's from the Honolulu Advertiser in Hawaii, Sunday, February 23rd, 1913. So in terms of how, the Americans, say the press and the rest of the United States looked at this, they were like, wow, these guys, they're rising to the challenge and the occasion of what's in front of them. There's something that they have to do. They're doing it, and let's see what comes out of it.
I want to continue for another 5-10 minutes before we do the questions and answers, but I have a question for you. I found something very interesting that had to do with, I think it was like Crete and Sicily, one of the articles translated. I kind of of my eye. But I want to make sure I let everybody know when you hit the chat later on, that question, we might be able to do the most verbally. But there's a link to get Peter's book on Amazon.com. Get get it there, and of course, physically also we are able to go on to and some other places. But while you're here in Hellenic History Series here on patreon.com, just want to let you know what we're doing, and we're doing more projects here as well, Balkan Wars and other different eras and historical issues. See if you like what we do, the videos we do, culinary, we're doing history, we're doing music, art, a lot of different projects, and they're all coming out of here. It's part of a nonprofit that was founded through their foundation, and it's a well-worthy cause. Everything that we do, you can find out about it. And become a patron for like $1, $5, whatever you can do it. Just help us so we can make more videos every week, and a lot of products, and getting exclusive perks, behind the scenes things, and you're gonna be helping us make a lot of more education products in different media. All right, and we'll talk a little bit more about it afterwards. But now, my question to you, Peter, is so I read that a lot of the Greeks that were going to fight back, and also there was a notion that Greece, they were trying to liberate Crete, right? Was on one of the islands that had to one reunion back with Greece, and it was a failed attempt with the Greco-Turkish War of 1897, and that led to the third deficit and a bailout. Before that you mentioned before, 4 or 5 bailouts that they had to receive from the Western powers, and then they had to pay also money to the Turks because we lost. So with Crete, there was also talk about liberating also Sicily now, or reuniting with Sicily. Does that mean that it was because the Greeks that lived in Sicily, or because they, the fellow, Italians that they wanted to help as well? Because I was in one of the articles. This is from like 1911 or 12, and it said Crete and Sicily wanted reunion with liberated by Greeks. Can you elaborate a little bit about that? I found that very interesting.
Well, there were Greeks everywhere, right? So by this time, I'd mentioned earlier that the Greek kingdom was very, very small, and there were areas all over Europe, and obviously now all over the world, where there were migrants who were now populating areas that you're talking about places that had a Greek influence for hundreds and hundreds of years versus some of the newer places like America. In terms of the participation, I can tell you that in terms of participating, there was an issue. There was an issue that came up, and the issue with Italy specifically was that the Italians had just fought the Ottomans, right? So there was a war that started in 1911 and ended in 1912, and it ended. It would everything was signed right after Montenegro declares war on the Ottoman Empire, and that was at the behest of the Italian nation. The Italian government kind of pushed Montenegro to declare war, knowing that everybody else would fall in line. And one of the most famous of Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi, right, the unifier of Italy, his son, Ricciotti Garibaldi, was the head of the Red Shirts. He inherited from his father, and they, the Red Shirts, had fought in 1897. They had actually fought in Greece and were one of the only successful units to win a battle in 1897. So Greece lost the war in 1897. The Garibaldis, they won. They won a battle for the Greeks. In 1912, Garibaldi, he actually says, "I'm going back to Greece. Greece is fighting a righteous war, and we're going back to help." The Italian government was very, very aware of the global situation. They had just finished fighting the Ottomans and were afraid that if they openly supported this, that there might be another war directly between the Ottoman Empire and Italy. So the Italian government said, this is not something that we can back, but they looked the other way, while Ricciotti Garibaldi, actually organized troops and went to Greece and reformed the Red Shirts and actually fought in the First Balkan War. And the Italian government actually was holding back most of the recruits and the volunteers. They could have had thousands upon thousands of Italians wanted to volunteer and fight for Garibaldi, but the Italian government put a stop to it. So in the end, there were only about 12 to 1,300 that went with, that were able to get to Greece from Italy, and the other half of the regiment was raised and was manned by Greek-Americans. And that was under a Greek officer, Romas. Romas commanded the Greek-Americans, and Garibaldi and his son, they commanded the other foreigners. So there were not only Italians that fought, there were other ethnicities as well. So that kind of kept things on the down low in what was, Italy as a whole.
I know that also in your book, you discuss specifically an American, an officer, I forgot if he was a colonel or a general, who has no Greek roots, at least that I guess you're aware of, but he also played a very significant role. Maybe you could just very briefly talk about him, and then I think we'll open it up to questions after that.
Yes, we have a few.
Absolutely.
Ready.
So thanks, George, for bringing that up. So I discovered that there was a retired brigadier general from the Tennessee National Guard that actually volunteered and fought in Greece and was wounded in combat. So not only did he actively participate, he wrote a book, and from that he continued to support the Greek ethnic group, not only in Nashville, where he was from, but Chicago as well. And he was he's a fascinating individual, and I've covered his life in the book. I was able to I was granted access by his descendants. I found them. I was lucky enough to reach out, and a great nephew, him and his family, I met with them, and they granted me exclusive access to General Thomas S. Hutchison's archive. So with that, I was able to put together his whole picture, and Colonel Hutchison was assigned to the Garibaldi Legion. He did not make it to meet up with Garibaldi, and so instead he was assigned to a Greek army division, and that's when he subsequently was wounded. However, Colonel Hutchison kept copious notes, and he actually wrote a series on one of the soldiers he met, an engineer, and of the Egyptian. He's Greek, and he was in Egypt and then in Asia Minor, so he's a diaspora Greek, and he met this young guy, this young soldier, and they became friends, and he wrote his story, which was later published in a Greek-American newspaper in Chicago, and it was never published anywhere else. It was in English, and it was a series of articles that he wrote out, and it was in his archive, and so it's in my book. So the only place after 100 years that you can read this story written by Colonel Hutchison outside of his book is here now. And so Hutchison was a great friend of the Greeks, of PhilHellene, and unfortunately he's now well known. And back in 2012, after I gave my first presentation, luckily his book was then translated into Greek, because it hadn't been translated. He had been interviewed in the Greek newspapers while he was in Greece. So they knew of him. Venizelos knew who he was, the prime minister, the premier of Greece, had met with him. The people there knew who he was. They had read about him. They knew him. The Greek Americans here all knew about him. However, he had been lost to time, to history. And so I'm very actually happy, proud, and honored that I'm able to bring him back to life. And I have his story, and I have articles that were written in American newspapers and in Greek-American newspapers about him and his life, and information through his archive on, what happened to him, what he did. And a fascinating man, friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, was a member of the Progressive Party. He was a police commissioner in Nashville. He did a ton of things, very much like Teddy Roosevelt, that type of a person, and a great friend of the Greeks here in the United States. And it's interesting that he actually met a lot of, in my book, you'll see that he met all the most interesting historical figures of the time in Greece. He met all of them. And
wow.
So
That's a very unusual, especially for its time, pretty challenging thing to do for most people. I mean, now we're so used to being able to travel easily. Now we're so used to being able to have such global access to everything. We have our Facebook and live streams and everything. Back then, you actually had to go there, travel, be there, and have that access, which, a lot of journalists were, so lucky as to have gotten. And this man who actually got to fight side by side has a very, very unique experience. And it's amazing that, I think it's so important. And unless there's a very big event, people tend to, unfortunately, historical fates of people can fall through the cracks sometimes. That's a very sad reality, because you know what? Their children move on, their grandchildren, and sometimes there isn't even that connection, or sometimes they don't have children, or for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. These histories get lost. And, thanks to people like Peter, he goes, he researches, he finds this, and he brings it to the fore. Again, like I said, history, a real historian doesn't rehash. He finds something new and he puts it on the table and gives it for everybody to offer, to analyze, and to ask further and deeper questions. And there are plenty of things like that in this book. Peter, this was an amazing talk. We're going to continue the discussion now. Again, we already mentioned you can get Peter's book on Amazon. Please do tell people about it. Please also, share this video. We're hoping that, we're all about stimulating a dialogue. And again, this subject could be easily the subject of several webcasts and shows on its own. And Vasily and I will continue to explore this era in history, of course, and everything that we do in it. And again, please join us on Patreon, even if it's just for $1. You figure $1 for a year, that's like buying a beer and a half, right? For people who are producing, a team that is producing, quality content and is very devoted to history and to getting it out there to the next generation. So please do that. And
we have videos with images, with maps, animated videos, and other things that we're going to be working on as well. So we're making some nice creative team. So yeah, just $1 or $5 or whatever have you, doesn't matter. If there's 1,000 people for $1, it's $1,000 a month that we can actually work to bring a lot of things that take away a lot of time, and they take a lot of time away from us too. That's what we want to be able to produce all these shows.
We want to get also quality people to help us out, to outsource some of the technical stuff, so it makes a better presentation and it reaches more people. That's what this is all about. So your help's greatly appreciated, and let's now move on to some questions.
Let me
how do we want to do this, Billy? Do we want people to write us the questions in the chat, or do we want to?
I prefer if you write it. If you're having a hard time with the chat, you can just raise your hand.
If we can see you, we have to let's get it so we can see.
We already have a couple of questions. Let me just bring the panel.
We'll go to the earlier questions here.
Mode.
Okay, Anthony already has a question.
We have a couple already waiting, so give us a second. When Peter. Okay,
I guess we'll go to the grid view over there.
Let's go to the grid.
We're still learning how to use Zoom, so please do be patient with us. Thank you.
Yeah, we switched from GoToMeeting and some other formats. Okay.
So let's scroll up a little bit. Do we have some questions? Okay, there was a question. Sorry about the sound again. We were trying to get this to work. It's our first time doing something like this. We're very glad we actually had a tremendous turnout, 20 people. That's really wonderful. It's like having a classroom, right, Peter?
That's right.
absolutely.
You got a full classroom.
You can hear both of us now, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Yes.
I know before was the microphone. I think I wasn't speaking directly into the headphone. All right. I think Kimon Thermos has a question. I think that's our friend Kimon.
Yes.
Hi, Kimon. Oh, let's let somebody else in as well. Hold on one second. All right. All right. Kimon asks, can Peter talk about the short Greek-Turkish alliance?
That has to refer that refers to the Second Balkan War, where the Greeks actually took the Bulgarians on while the Turks were doing their thing on their side against the Bulgarians. So basically Serbia and Greece went at it with Bulgaria, and it was a very short war. It was about a month or so, and so obviously at this point in time, the Turks were actually going at it with the Bulgarians, and the Greeks were not fighting the Turks. So that's
very unusual situation, I must say.
Yes, absolutely.
Very unusual. I mean, it still kicks me in the head when I think about it. And then World War I, Bulgaria and Turkey are aligned against Greece. I mean,
Yes.
And Romania is involved as well in the next Balkan Wars.
Yeah, Romania was involved at sort of at the end of the Second Balkan War. They didn't want to get too much into it, but when they mobilized their forces, they were able to make sort of like a land grab without really fighting. But the Bulgarians, they didn't know what to do now. So now they have multiple fronts. They're fighting the Greeks. They're fighting the Serbians. They have the Ottomans on the other side. And now the Romanians are also mobilizing and have actually advanced.
Did they get Constanza? Is that the territory that they got, the Romanians?
Yes, up on the top there. Yeah, so...
Greek area, by the way. There's a lot of Greeks to this day.
Well, there's Greeks in Romania. We know from what the Turks had done. They, to punish the Greeks, they had exiled them and sent them up into Romania. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of ethnic Greeks in Romania. So that was one of the problems that you start facing. How do you then, you go from an alliance, you go from allies to now adversaries. And when the Bulgarians felt that they could take on everybody, they had believed a lot of what they were told. They believed in themselves, there's nothing wrong with that. However, they may have believed in themselves a little too much. Yeah. And
too soon, too much.
Yes. So it played out the way it did, and they lost. The Greeks came very close to losing themselves. They made some strategic and tactical issues and errors. And if it wasn't for the Greek government and Venizelos stepping in, who knows how it may have not turned out as well as it did. So timing was everything at the end.
I think from my studies, Venizelos and the army beat the Serbs by an hour to liberate Thessaloniki, right? The army that was going down south from Serbia and Bulgaria, we got Thessaloniki like within an hour before everybody else. Liberated.
Yes, we did, but that's the First Balkan War. We're talking about the Second Balkan War. In the Second Balkan War, the commander-in-chief, Constantine himself, the king, his strategy was to decapitate the enemy by taking the capital. So he wanted to go after the Bulgarian capital and just obliterate Bulgaria altogether. And as he was doing that, which is the second time he kind of overstepped his bounds. The first time was during the First Balkan War. He had to be told, what you're referring to is, take Thessaloniki. If you don't take it, then the Bulgarians and the Serbs are going to actually occupy, and we're not going to be able to take it. So Venizelos sent an immediate message and appealed to King George. Right? He appealed to Constantine's father. Told him, please go take, well, not please, he was ordered. So there's a famous telegram of him ordering, the commander-in-chief. Remember that Venizelos was the premier and the secretary of war. So he outranked the commander-in-chief. So that was the first incident. Second incident was the king now, Constantine I, his father had been assassinated, was taking the troops, and they were going straight into Bulgaria. And as they continued forward into Bulgaria, the Greek forces were being outflanked. So he was hoping to go take out Sofia, take out the head of Bulgaria, and the country would collapse, and Greece would win a major victory. Luckily, it didn't play out that way. It played out, I think, in a better way, because the Bulgarians would have never capitulated anyway. So that's one of the issues.
And we should learn that from history as well. It's 1,000 years. We should know that. We should know better.
Yeah.
We have another question. Let's see now.
Just go up a little bit more. The other way, down.
This one. Can Peter talk?
I'm sorry.
iPhone 4.
Whatever iPhone 4 is.
Can Peter talk about where he got the bulk of his issue material for the book?
The source material. The source material.
Is that what it says?
Yeah, it says the source material for the book.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So in other words, where'd you get all this from?
So George mentioned that I'd been out of grad school for decades. So when I went back into researching, I had to adapt to the digital age. I knew microfilm, so that's where that story about buying, an actual microfilm projector. I bought my own, and I bought like a dozen or more reels of New York Times newspapers, and I found that it was too difficult to actually, spend time trying to make that machine work and read these articles. So I dove into the internet, and luckily there's a lot of sources for newspapers, right? So one of the premises behind the book itself is that I use American source material. It's all primary sources, and I didn't use anybody else's, right? So yeah, there's maybe one or two articles from England or an English newspaper. I think one from New Zealand, one article from Australia, because I couldn't find a proper counterpart from American press. So I dived into American newspapers almost exclusively, and I backed that up with primary source books that were written. Believe it or not, there's several books, including Colonel Hutchison's book. And that's how I put this together. So the bulk of this comes from harnessing the power of the internet and looking up, for example, Library of Congress and using newspapers that are there. I had to actually go to a variety of paid sources for some of the newspapers. So this is almost exclusively an American-made product to illustrate, the story of the Greek-Americans, right? So I wanted to make sure that I captured the individual. George, you had mentioned earlier, like the stories of these men. Who were they, right? So when you first start reading about the Balkan Wars, it's just like these little paragraphs of things happened and over there and over here and some dates. I wanted to use the names to bring these guys to life. And so for those that have relatives that fought, you stand the chance of maybe finding them, because I tried to make sure that I copied everybody's name the way it appeared in print. And it's remarkable the amount of people that are quoted and the names that are used in American press for these forgotten Greek Americans. So I wanted to use them exclusively because it's their story.
Fantastic. It's one. That's, again, we got to be grateful that people like Peter exist, because without that, people's history can just disappear through the cracks. And that's, and whenever we're in the Orthodox Church and they say memory eternal, well, that of course refers to the divine realm, but it also refers to our memory too, because when we remember these people, we keep them in our lives and in our hearts. That's also very important, because we're all, when people go to that world, we're still part of the same world at the end of the day. We're all going to meet again. So wonderful that you did that. We have another question coming in here.
So you know what? Before we ask, I think
Anthony had a question. Anthony was raising his hand.
Anthony Pappas.
So
yes, okay. Let's see. Epiroutans, all four of my grandparents were born in Epirus under the Ottoman Empire in the 1880s. So when the Balkan War started, they were in the process of getting married and starting their families. So my father was born in 1909. My mother was born in 1914. But Epiroutans commemorate the Balkan Wars by celebrating the date when the Greek army marched into Ioannina. So there is a commemoration. Do you remember what that date was?
Right. So you're talking about it's very there's a really good story behind the fall of Ioannina. The Fort Bezani was the fortress that was outside that protected all of Ioannina. And when they finally took that fortress, that's when they liberated Epirus. One of the observations that Colonel Hutchison made when he got up to the area was that it seemed that General Sapoudzakis, the divisional commander of all the troops, was taking a lot of time. He wasn't sure why he was organizing and using a lot of artillery, and just it seemed like he was waiting. The truth of the matter is there was an ethnic Greek who was forced to serve in the Ottoman Empire. He was in Bizani, and he was sending information, secret reports to the general staff, the Greek general staff. And because of him, he saved a lot of lives. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more Greek soldiers dying to try to take that fort for no reason at all, because they knew that the Turks were starving, and they were having issues with supplies and command and control. So they kind of like waited it out for them to, have their internal disarray. So you talk about the dates. Dates are fascinating. One of the things that I did mention in the book early on is that the Greek calendar and the American calendars, they don't coincide. So the dates that you and I might know are typically not the same dates so if you were to look up, December 15th in an American newspaper, it's not December 15th in Greece. So the dates that we've adopted, modern dates, don't all coincide. And that was one of the biggest issues that I had trying to find information on battles, because the dates between the old calendar and the new calendar, the Julian and the Gregorian, it became an issue. However, I did, in my book, I put it all together. I worked really, really hard, and I was able to not only get you the dates, but I also have the actual battles themselves. So we mentioned the Battle of Bizani, Ioannina. The soldiers themselves were given medals. The medals, there's an actual a small addendum to the medal, right? So there's a little plaque with the place that they fought. Where they fought and the names don't coincide with places today historically. I put it all together. So if you have a relative or you know anybody or you're interested in one of the battles and you were to look up somewhere like Driskos or Ostrovon. Ostrovon doesn't exist today, and it's not in any of the military records. I was able to put it all together so that you could then follow by date, by location, and by the awarding of the medal, who, what, and where the battles themselves took place. So in the book, you'll actually find the dates, so you'll be able to actually get a better picture of when they occurred and what the American equivalent is. So it's in one of the indexes. You'll be able to follow through. And what I have is the official liberation of Ioannina is February 21st of 1913. Which again may not coincide with what the Greek army, the Greek government, the Greek kingdom, or the Greek Republic recognizes, or the cultural actual date. But that's the actual date that it actually happened on in terms of, understanding the calendars and the different calendars.
Okay, that sounds about right in terms of what the Society of Epirotes here in New York City celebrate when they are able to, hold the celebration.
Oh,
Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.
Continue, George. We have
all right, John Siams. Yeah, we have a lot of participants here.
Wait, hold on. Super Hutchinson, the sound is great now. Okay.
Yeah. Again, we're sorry that we've had some technical problems. We're still trying to iron this out. John asks, what were the Greek territorial gains in the Balkan Wars, and how much of an impact did the Greek-Americans have in those territorial gains? Like, in other words, how do they contribute? How much do they contribute? Okay.
All right. Well, in terms of the American contribution, as far as the sources themselves tell us, the Americans that went there, their numbers were in the tens of thousands, right? So it's upwards of 30,000 left the United States to go fight in Greece. So
Amazing.
in terms of I found some source material that says that a third of the Greek army was made up of basically Greek-Americans. And yes, there were a few from Canada. There was a couple of hundred from Cyprus, Egypt, a lot of Greeks in Egypt. They all came together, and more showed up than the Greek government anticipated. And one thing to remember is there's a difference between the volunteers and those that were reservists. So when we talk about the Greeks of the diaspora, right, the real diaspora, not the Greeks that went to work in America. We're talking about Greeks that were in Egypt. They didn't have to go fight. The Greeks in Cyprus didn't have to go fight. Now, some of the Canadians, the Greeks that were in Canada, they were obligated to fight. So out of the, let's say, 45,000 that actually went to fight from the United States, probably 10,000 or more were complete volunteers. They came from the unredeemed places or areas of Greece. So the islands, we said, all these areas that were still under the Ottomans, they didn't have to go fight. They volunteered and they fought in the Greek army or in the Garibaldi legions. So that's a big to-do. And like I said, in the book, you'll find multiple references to how well the Greek Americans performed. Some of them had gotten trades. They had gotten educated. They had technical skills. There was one individual, which I have early on in the book, he had gotten his pilot's license. Now, unfortunately, they didn't let him fly, but they made somebody like that a machine gunner. So a machine gun back then was a technical machine, and you couldn't just give it to somebody that was, a subsistence farmer, right? You had to get somebody that had some kind of knowledge on how to work gears and how to take something apart. So that volunteer that had unfortunately, he shipped his own plane. They made him a machine gunner, which was a quote prestigious position. The average person wouldn't get to do that. So throughout my work, you'll see that I made sure I included how much of an impact, which was great, the Greek Americans had on the actual outcomes.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but did I hear you correctly? Approximately 1/3 of the armed forces were Greek Americans?
They were from the outside.
That's a big number.
Yes, the Greeks did not.
That's a huge number.
The Greek military, there was a major obligation. First of all, not all the Greeks that were reservists returned, right? So guys that owned restaurants, many of them, they didn't just decide to leave their restaurants and go fight. Many did. Those that didn't go sent money. Many of them would pay for other Greeks that didn't have enough to pay for their way to go. They paid. So they expected, there was an obligation for maybe 30,000 Greeks to show up from the outside to come back. There were more than 30,000 that showed up. And then they experienced issues with arming them. And that's one of the issues that the Garibaldi unit had. They were given old weapons. They were given the old Gras rifles. And they had issues with that because these things were like, 40, 50 years old. And the Mannlicher was the brand new rifle that was a special edition made for the Greek army, and they didn't have enough to give out to everyone. And that's one of the other reasons they didn't want to take volunteers. So they were like, we don't have time to train these guys. So it's better that we get the reservists. But at one point, they just accepted, they started accepting the other guys as well.
Just we have a lot of more questions here.
Excellent.
So we're just going to try to
Thank you, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Those
you.
were actually very important questions, I think. Eleni.
Eleni Zuzma.
Yes. What role did the minorities in Thrace play, like the Pomaks and the Macedonian Slavs?
Interesting question.
Right. So I cover what was going on previous, right? So working its way up to 1912, I included, for context purposes, I included a fair amount of what was going on in those regions. So generally speaking, a lot of the areas that were still under the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire expected all these millets, right, these subdivisions, to provide recruits for the army. And the fact that a lot of them did not actually present themselves for the Ottoman service, and those that deserted, right, there were thousands that deserted when war broke out, was one of the reasons that the Ottoman Empire later on really looked down on the issue of their minorities. How do you properly integrate these minorities into the greater scheme of the Ottoman Empire when you can't get them to fight for, their quote, their country? So that became an issue, became a problem. A lot of the peoples from the regions in what we refer to as Macedonia were being manipulated. They were being manipulated by Bulgarians, and especially by the Bulgarians. The Bulgarians were rabidly looking to indoctrinate a lot of those peoples so that they could then use them as part of an excuse to expand their territorial areas. So there was a lot of guerrilla fighting prior to the start of the official Balkan War. There was a lot of guerrilla fighting, a lot of bad things going on amongst those peoples. One town and one village would attack another, and then they would commit atrocities, and then you'd have individual agents that were sent by the Bulgarian government per se, and they would then carry out these propaganda stuff and arming of groups. That was another issue that they had to work out.
Thank you, Peter.
We have so many more people who want to engage. This is really great. We have to just make it a little quicker though, because we're not too big on time right now.
Carol Petrovic, who's also from Hellenic Genealogy Geek. We love your site. You do a lot of research that's very useful to thousands of people, not millions around the world. Carol, thank you for your work. You have a question for Peter? A question about your methodology as a writer and researcher. I would love to know how you accumulated your massive research material. What was your process?
All of the stuff that goes in here, in other words.
Peter, I'll tell you, I was blown away when I got your book, and I started flipping through it, and I started looking at the sources, and I'm like, holy mackerel, you did a ton of work. First of all, how many years were you researching? And secondly of all, how did you organize this material cohesively? Was there a particular software package that you used? Did you was it a writing program? Did you keep an Excel spreadsheet? Don't go into too much detail because we don't have much time, but I'm just curious as to how you kept it all together.
It took me 7.5 years, and I gave up no less than 4 times trying to put this together. And right. When I first began, I thought that this was going to be maybe a 180-page book, because there's no material out there. Who would imagine that there would be this much? So I got to a point where I knew the weather for Hawaii in October of 1912. Like, given any particular week, I knew the weather forecast. So I was overwhelmed. I quickly became overwhelmed. Initially, what I tried to do when I started finding all this information, I used software, I used spreadsheets, I did Excel, I did all that stuff, and I was not successful. I even started breaking down newspapers by state and then by city, and then that didn't work, because I decided it would be best if I tried to keep it in a timeline, a narrative timeline, and then it got so big. It almost ran away from me. And when we started earlier talking about I wanted to talk about the regiment, the Greek-American soldiers, and then I realized I have to give them a context. So from there, you see, it went to, all right, well, what did these guys, I was able to find out not only their names, I found out where they lived, what they did. I found pictures of them. So they truly came to life. So then I started thinking, okay, let me simplify it. What was it like living in the United States in 1912? That's how I started that. So, okay. And then I moved forward from there. Did I find an article that maybe described Greek-American life? And I did. I found something phenomenal. You're going to be surprised at what it was like to live in New York City in 1911, 1912 with Greek bookstores.
Yeah.
The cafeteria, the coffee shops, all this stuff. It's mind-boggling. And that's what I did. So I kept thinking, if I was there and I was with these Greek Americans, what was it like? What was life like? And then what would be the journey then back? And that's kind of what kept me grounded. And then from there, I was able to tease out what you see here.
It's phenomenal work. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Okay. Eleni has another question. Do you have any primary sources in Greek?
Primary sources in Greek abound. There is a lot of them. As a matter of fact, as I started digging, reaching out, I was able to find sources that were translated from Greek into English, which boggles the mind, that are just on the Balkan Wars. So now, because I wanted this to be an effort in researching from an American perspective, could anyone research a topic as exotic as this, and in terms of being an ethnic Greek, ethnic American, could an ethnic anything find enough information to delve into something in depth? And the answer obviously is yes. So the only time I used the Greek source material was to do some fact checking. And so there's plenty of stuff, and there might be one or two. I believe I have probably 5 or 6 books that I mentioned in my bibliography. But believe it or not, there's a lot of academic papers, and they're written in English. But there's a ton of Greek stuff. If you have the capacity to use the internet and your primary language is Greek, there's multitude of books on the Balkan Wars and written in Greek.
Thank you. Athanasios Livanis writes, great turnout, everyone. Congratulations, Peter. Great endeavor and very important contribution to our Greek-American heritage and history. He had to just step out, but that's a message from Athanasios Livani.
Thank you, Thanasi.
Dr. John Ciolas writes, very good. Dr. John.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, Eleni.
Eleni Juzma.
Eleni Juzma. Well, I call people by their first names. Except Mount Athos, which continues to use Julian, and of course, millions of Orthodox Christians. Fascinating. Thank you. So even minority Muslims were unwilling to support the Turks to some extent. I think we have some more down there, or is that another comment? Oh, Eleni, many thanks to both for another super event. Well, thank you for joining us and for supporting us. Yeah, so Peter, please comment on that. The issue of even minority Muslims were unwilling to support the Turks to a certain extent. That's the thing. It's like, it doesn't mean that necessarily they were able to get, this kind of a pan-Islamic movement going or whatever, right? It appears that they,
Okay, so it's interesting. There's been some research and some books written on the minorities, the Turkish Muslim minorities in Crete. Numbers are big, but let's say the Turkish element in other areas. Say, for example, in the island of Chios, right, one of the larger islands. The Turkish representation, those that were living there along with the garrison that was, say, in Chios, they weren't living in and amongst the people like the Greeks of Asia Minor, right? So the Greeks in the interior of Asia Minor were living amongst, the Turks. In some of these other predominantly Greek Christian areas, there were small areas or pockets of the Turks. So at this time, 1912, the Turks that lived, say, like in the capital of Chios, which is referred to as Chora, they weren't looking for anything other than status quo. And when the Greeks showed up, the Turkish garrison was forced to actually engage. They were forced to fight. Some of the other places, they decided to go into, for example, Lesbos. They went into the mountains, or the equivalent of. They just went out into. They didn't stay. They fought guerrilla warfare, or guerrilla style. So the minorities that existed, for the most part, as they did in the interior, the normal average person got along. Everybody pretty much got along. Now, what the military did, or what agents of the government did, that's a different story. That's kind of not, it's interesting. When the Greek army, quote, liberated areas or unified areas, what did the Turkish people do? Some of them in the north, some of them left. Some of them immediately were leaving. The Bulgarians, it's a known fact that the Bulgarians pushed all of those minorities out. They didn't want them at all. They had to flee because they were being executed. As a matter of fact, the Turkish army, the POWs, were paid their salaries. So out of the money that I mentioned that the Greek government had actually borrowed to actually carry out the war, they paid the Turkish soldiers and officers, they paid them their salaries. They fed them, they housed them. So now that's the military. In terms of the people, the exchange was in 1922 and 23. It wasn't really in 1912. I mean, except for the military, right? The military, I mentioned Chios because that's my background. The military
news again, Chios, your islands in the news. I think the minister from the Turkish government, one of the top officials, just said that we want to take that back. That's our
yes.
island, and our hearts
Yes.
break every morning.
Right. They don't believe. They don't. The current prime minister is refuting the actual any of the accords that were signed after the Balkan Wars. He says that they don't exist. He doesn't recognize them, and so all the original territories that we've been talking about, he says that they belong to Turkey, not the Ottoman Empire, not yet. But he says they belong to Turkey.
Very well said, Peter. Very well said.
He's going forward, but in reverse.
Yes.
I want to just. I think that's the last question. I just want to just make one point. So, from my maternal grandfather came to the States in California about 100 years ago, and some of the other relatives. And then, in general, I hardly even knew that. I knew a little bit about that, but that's in the 20s though. But when I came back from Greece, I was born here, and I came back from Greece sometime in '83. My parents came back when I was 9. I grew up with the Greeks in Astoria and in New York, but I never heard. And and as I grew older, I'm very involved in history and Greek studies, right? I kind of never, I can't say never, but this thing about the Greeks of the 1900s, the 1880s, that was never really taught to us. There were some courses and some books, obviously in Queens College, where I attended, of authors that wrote about the Greek-American history that goes back to the time of Columbus and all that.
Got some pictures too. I just wanted to show everybody. We also have some pictures, and Peter has actually plenty more that you weren't even able to publish. Just sorry, wanted to make sure I didn't forget to mention that.
No. So what I want to just make the point is, like, I was not aware that we had such a history in America in the 1900s. Like to this extent, and I'm somebody that's kind of aware, and I do a lot of research, right? So what you're doing, Peter, is amazing, because somehow this history fell down the cracks, and it's not taught. it's right, Carol. We all know a little bit about this, but I mean, come on, this is something that's so important that Greek Americans were so many and so influential in 1900, 1910, 1912. The film industry, the food industry, the wars, World War One, the Balkan Wars, and we're not told this stuff, and we're told we're just a bunch of immigrants that came in the 70s or the 60s, those waves of a lot of the Greek Americans that came in the 60s and 70s, and all the ones that came before them are forgotten, and this is amazing. So I'm very proud of you. I know you so many years. We've done so many wonderful projects together, and this is a great book. I started reading it already,
Thank
and
you.
I want to thank you.
Thank you, Billy.
Thank you. And also our applause to all the people who joined us today. Thank you so much for
Yes, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate the support.
Peter, I really hope we're going to have you on again. I know you have a lot more to talk about, and not just about the Balkan Wars, although that in itself is a very wide subject for discussion, which I think we also will be touching upon more in the future. But thank you so much for doing this, and most importantly, thank you for writing a good book, a good history book. A good history book's actually kind of a rare thing. I think that's a very important thing to point out, because this isn't really done for the money. It's done for the passion, and there are a lot of more things. If you took the amount of hours Peter put into this book, I'm sure you could make some bigger money with it, do other things that are more fun and enjoyable. But no, he said no to all those things so he could produce something that will go beyond his own lifetime. So take an opportunity to appreciate that and to pass it on.
Thank you, George.
Right. Can I ask a quick question, Billy? Can I ask a quick question? So, Peter, how are you getting the word out about this book? I mean, this is a groundbreaking book. The way you've put it together, the sources that you've used, how you pulled together stories of individuals by the news articles and the research you've done. I've never read a book like this. So I'm just curious, how are you getting this out to the community through public appearances now, or we kind of have to hold off? But do you have a website for the book? I didn't find one. How are you getting the word out?
I'm trying to harness social media as best I can, and then with the help of Billy and George and friends and family. Personally, I've reached out to 37 universities so far that have a Greek studies program that include modern Greek, because the classical stuff typically doesn't really, care about any of the modern stuff. But I found 37 individual universities, and I've actually heard back from some of them. And I'm also reaching out to some of the societies that are out there, and I've actually gotten some response back from some of them as well. But social media is the biggest thing. So with your help and everyone else, that's how I'm going to get it out. I've contacted my alumni associations, and some of them, I'm sure there'll be some interest. It's
okay. Great job.
So whatever you can come up with, I'm here for you, and I'm willing to do more conferences, and I've been to some of the genealogy stuff, and a lot of the people unfortunately don't know about their history. Some of the older communities do, though. You'd be surprised, but some of the others don't. And
that's another topic, Billy, for discussion for another day. How are we going to preserve the records of the Greek-American community? Because a lot of these books now, when I go into the churches, they're 100+ years old, and I'm seeing the same situation with them that I'm seeing in the books in Greece. They're falling apart, and there is no initiative right now to get them preserved. So anyway, another topic for another day. Thank you. Well, Peter, love to get your book out and about. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Peter, maybe right before we leave, maybe you can get out your email. So if anybody wants to contact you for any, for any promotional or anything like that, or
absolutely,
maybe
absolutely.
1912
NYC at Gmail. You can find me on LinkedIn, and I'll have an academia.com place for some of the other activities that I'll be doing. In Search of Hellenism, I'm going to put up a blog and do a podcast is where I'd like to go with this. I've discovered a lot of other things in my research that I want to talk about. So that's eventually where I'm going to grow into, and I'm going to continue working with Billy and George and Prometheus, and doing some of these talks and conferences. Indiana State and some of the other universities have already, Queens College, they all have Greek studies programs. I'm going to be doing something with them as well. So hopefully we'll keep the momentum going. I don't want this to go, on a shelf somewhere, be forgotten like these people, like these men did. That's the point, is to get it out there. And that's the reason I use names. I put names in this book so that people could maybe look for relatives or, bring these guys to life.
Great. It's great. So the link is in the chat. It's also on the page where you got this from, on Patreon. On Amazon, you can get it, right?
Yes, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's Nook and Kindle. So if anybody wants to get a digital version instead, that's not a problem. My publisher put that together as well. And, if it wasn't for the world we live in, I expected to do some, book signings and go back to the Hellenic Federation. I'm sure they'd like to have me back. With Billy's help, I had done one before.
We'll have to do something in the springtime.
Yeah. So who knows? Maybe, hopefully, I know the Washington Greek Museum. They're doing. They were advertising. I wrote an article for their newsletter. I reached out to the Lowell, Massachusetts Greek group, the Acropolis, that's on Facebook, and they're very supportive as well. I've reached out to some of my contacts in Greece, and I don't know. Maybe I'll get back out to California. I've done presentation there before, so who knows? Maybe I'll.
Some of our HEPA chapters, they've tuned in. So some of the members I see. So thank you.
That's great. Yes, thank you very much. And then Nashville. I'm going back to Nashville at some point, by hook or by crook. I'll be back in Nashville. I'm gonna go back and visit with Colonel Hutchison's family, who I'm in touch with, and do a presentation there. Hopefully, maybe at a HEPA chapter. The church there is not completely Greek, but that's okay. Maybe we'll do it at a VFW. I definitely want to share this. It's a labor of love, and so it's for everybody.
We want to thank also UNESCO Piraeus, our club that we both belong to.
Absolutely.
Modern Music, HEPA, Hellenic Genealogy Geek, and so many other friends that are here. Lou Scalzo, hi.
Miami Lou.
You guys are good friends.
Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you. So if you're going to purchase the book, we also ask, if you use Amazon Smile and use the Porphyra Foundation, our foundation, as your choice foundation to purchase it. That gives like 0.05% to the Porphyra Foundation. So
outstanding.
Use it on Amazon Smile. Please make that your default, or if you can. And right here on Patreon, this is the Quest for Prometheus. Spread the word for us, the Hellenic History series, and hopefully you can become a patron too, and just tell other people about what we do. And we're going to be doing more things with Peter as well, because he's part of the family.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
So much, everybody. I thank every single one of you for joining us, because that's what makes this a success. This is all about all of us participating, all of us being able to actually interact and ask questions. And God bless you all. Thank you so much, and we really look forward to seeing you on all of our other broadcasts. And of course, thank you, Peter, very much.
Thank you so much. Like our pages on YouTube, Basilius Chrissochos, that's the Hellenic History series, and Porphyra, and also on Love Letters to Greece on Facebook. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.